Welcome again to In Conversations with Chana. I'm Chana Weisberg, editor of the Jewishwoman.org, and I'm joined today by a very special guest, Rabbi Avrami Zippel. So it's been a while since you were on here a little while ago.
Almost coming up on 2 years ago. It was, coming up on 3 years ago. That was like right when Zoom was getting really popular. It was the height of COVID.
Wow. So anyone who's watching, you can really watch the rabbi's last interview, but a lot has been happening since then. And can you tell us a little about it? I mean, there's been a court case, a memoir, lots of exciting things.
It's been a busy couple of years. So I publicly came forward with my story in a certain sense in February of 2019. At that point, I was having to testify in open court about the fact that I was sexually abused as a child by a family caregiver, and for a number of reasons, the situation was right and it warranted coming forward publicly. And so I did, with a slight caveat in the sense that it was still an ongoing matter in the courts, and there was a pretty significant limit on what I could talk about and what I could talk about, just given the specifics of our justice system. On March 12th, 2020, that entire process wrapped itself up, literally hours before the onset of COVID. And in my family, we joke about the fact that that hearing, the last hearing, was erev COVID. It was literally, there was someone who was there in the courtroom who ran off to the Capitol right after the hearing because the governor was holding a press conference in which she was shutting down the state. And once the whole episode wrapped itself up, it presented me with a question, and that was, so now there's no one that is holding me back from telling the story in its entirety aside from myself, and how much am I really willing and comfortable to tell the story in its entirety? So that summer, the summer of 2020, as the Zoom circuit was developing, I started talking about it more and more just to kind of see if people were receptive to the story. In my mind, I had shared some very basic details the year before, and I was very content to leave it at that. And I came to understand and experience that people were interested in hearing the story in all of its gory details and a lot of the ups and downs and the journey of everything that had led me to that point. And so after enough arm twisting and cajoling and some incredible hashgacha pratis, divine providence, the opportunity presented itself just about a year ago to write a book, to put it all on paper and to tell it in a really organized fashion and methodical fashion. Just after Pesach last year, I was signed to a book deal, and now a year later, I can't believe it's been a year. It's been probably the longest and shortest year of my life. A year later, we actually have a book, which is going to be widely distributed on May 23rd, the week before Shavuos. So I actually got my first batch of copies last night.
Can you tell us again so people can see the name? The book is called...
So the book is called Not What I Expected, a 20-year journey to reclaim a child's voice.
And that's a picture of you.
And that is a picture of me holding a picture of me.
Okay.
That is a picture of where I was at in life right before everything started. I'm sorry, I'm trying to manage. You have to go the other way when you're holding something up to a camera. And writing it was a cathartic process. It was also a mildly terrifying process. And it's interesting. I think a lot of the experiences that you go through in the very beginning of telling your story, and you put yourself out there to a certain extent, and you wonder to yourself and you worry to yourself, what if no one cares? And what if the story turns people off? And you go through 4 years of that, and you should have enough evidence to convince yourself that that's not the case. And your story is one that people are receptive to. And yet every single time someone will send me a WhatsApp, I just pre-ordered it, there's still a small tinge of that, oh no, they ordered it. What if they hate it and they never want to talk to me again? And so, I think that's par for the course on a certain level. And I think you go through that and you come to expect that on a certain level. And life is about acclimating to that and just dealing with that.
Well, I think there was a lot of points in your story where you were very nervous about your name getting out there and people knowing. I mean, at one point you said, no matter what, you wanted your name to be completely anonymous during the court case, because there's no way that you can face being known as the sexual abuse survivor in your community. And no matter what you would do, that's how you would be known as. So how did you overcome that? And why were you so against being known against your name being disclosed?
So one of the most interesting parts of that whole journey is I remember where I was the first time I said that, and I said that to the police officer who was taking my statement at the very, very beginning. And I told him, you need to promise me that you're going to keep my name out of this. And he understood me. He was very validating in a sense. He's like, I can understand the complex nature of your community, and you have my word. And then when the case was handed off from the police department to the prosecutor's office, we had the same conversation, and they too were very, very understanding. And I think on the first level, that validation in and of itself was so valuable because it gave space for a person to live with their own thoughts for a moment. And I think that for me, one of the powerful lessons that I learned throughout the story is that there is such value in allowing people to develop at their own pace, to come out of something at their own pace. And, those conversations could have gone differently. And the cop or the prosecutor could have said, oh, yeah, don't sweat it. And if anyone gives you a hard time, you don't worry about them. And that wasn't the attitude at all. And I think that just the validation of that concern in and of itself was really empowering and comforting on some level. As I told all of those parties and all of those conversations, I was quite certain that should this story ever get out publicly, that would be the only thing that would define my life amongst my friends and family and wider community. That would be it. In fact, I said to the prosecutor these words. I said, one day the day might come that I will cure cancer. But if the story gets out, anything which I might accomplish in life will be of third importance to this dynamic. And ultimately, that wall broke down brick by brick. I told one person, told a local person here in my community, I'm sitting at my desk here in my office. It was the spring of 2018. I was sitting in this very chair, and all of a sudden court dates were something which were a reality on my calendar. And when a court date is scheduled, no one really checks with you if you're free that morning. They tell you there will be a hearing, and if you want to attend, great, but that's when it is. And there was someone here in my office, member of the community, who I was working with on a project at that point. And I said to her that I had to reschedule a meeting that we had. I had to reschedule it. And she was like, oh, no problem. Do you have something else that morning? And I don't know why I told the truth in that moment. I said, yeah, I have a court date. And she was like, oh, is everything okay? I said, yeah. Someone hurt me as a child, and they're in court. And all of a sudden, the alarm, 5-alarm fire goes off in your head, and you're like, oh, take that back. Just have a doctor's appointment. That could have been a perfectly plausible explanation. And she reacted with such empathy and such understanding. And so, one brick came off the wall. But that one brick gave me the confidence to be honest with someone the next week when I had to explain an absence. And another brick came off the wall. And slowly the wall came down. And what was most fascinating when that wall came down is what I had feared and anticipated is precisely what happened amongst my friends and family and wider community. It's exactly what my claim to fame is at the moment.
That's what I was just going to ask you.
Their reaction is no different than I had anticipated. I think the fundamental change was not in their mind, but in mine.
So you don't mind. You don't mind being known.
For the longest time, I had been daunted by that reality of, what if they think that about me? And I think that I had done enough internal healing to develop the attitude of, well, if they think that about me, and if they see my life as that one-dimensional, that's really unfortunate for them. I'm very comfortable being in that space, but I feel like my life is multicolored and it's got a lot going for it. And if someone wants to live somewhat locked into that perspective, I can't fight that. But that's going to be, on a certain sense, that's going to be their loss and not mine. And I think that it really goes to show that it was my own attitude that needed to develop around this conversation and not anybody else's.
Interesting. So it's interesting, as I was reading your book, you're not the typical, or what we would consider the typical, survivor of abuse. You hid it your entire life. You were an extremely high achiever. You didn't fall off you gave no outward signs that you were being abused. In fact, you were excelling at everything that you took on. And you wrote, I couldn't afford to be a normal, average, run-of-the-mill student. Deep down, I feared that if I wasn't seen as the best or the brightest, I'd be found out for who I really was, a fraud, a fake, immoral, unclean, unfit to be a rabbi. So, was this a cry for help from a broken soul? And what did that feel like? Why did you feel this need to be such a high achiever?
I told this story before, and it's one that I really relate to. About a year and a half ago, I was on a panel around child safety, and there were a number of us on the panel, and there was Q&A from the crowd, and there was a parent in the audience who asked, what are the red flags? What are some of the symptoms that you can snuff out if your child might be struggling? And one of the panelists just, read off a list and a correct list and a comprehensive list of troubling behaviors and physical symptoms and emotional symptoms. And he was really harping on, if your kid starts declining academically, if they're not performing in school, if their grades are suffering, these are important things to look out for. And it was not the most Hamish panel, it wasn't like, I'll say something, and I really thought about this, and I broke every protocol, and I jumped out of line, and I said, I'd really like to add something if that's okay. Your child struggling academically is absolutely a symptom of their struggling in a wider capacity, and your child succeeding academically in an unhealthy fashion is equally as alarming and as dangerous. If a child starts to feel pressured to excel at the highest possible level and reacts in a very viscerally emotional way to anything less than perfection, that should be as much of a warning sign than if their grades just go off a cliff.
So you were doing that to get away from yourself?
I was, as I've said in more Jewish, that was not at a Jewish event, but I said as a Jewish event, I said, some people imagine that survivors of childhood trauma only know how to drown their sorrows in alcohol. I drowned my sorrows in Gemara. I literally, and the same way we imagine, a young person who's struggling and they sit there with the bottle and they just, take a deep swig and try to bury all the pain in that drink. Think of that exact same scenario, the same pain and the same desire to escape and the same unhealthiness. And instead of a bottle, it's a nice fat Gemara.
Wow.
And that was my reality.
It's important to realize that and to know that that's a possible way of reacting.
I agree. And I think it's, it goes, obviously we want every child to succeed and we encourage our children to succeed. And, so I don't want to ruin it for the audience, but my grandfather was your uncle. You knew him as well as almost as well as I knew him. And we as kids, we would call him up on the phone in Toronto. I got 101 on a test. And, you couldn't have gotten 102. And it was part of our childhood, and it was who he was. And we raised children in that environment a little bit. But there comes a time where I think as parents and as adults and educators, we need to realize there's a line. And if a child recoils in horror at a 98.
Right.
Perhaps it's worth a deeper look. Perhaps it's worth trying to understand what is going on beneath the surface for that child and why they have such a visceral reaction to that.
Why they feel their self-esteem is being represented in that number.
And why 98 is the end of their world. Right. What is wrong with less than perfection? If a child lives in a world where there's that absolute need to maintain that veneer of perfection, why is that? And what happens to them if that facade cracks a little bit? Why is that reacted to like that?
Right. Because underneath it, you say, beneath my smile, behind my words, I was convinced God hated me. I'm such a failure, such a waste of life. God must hate me. What was that life like? And do you still feel that God hates you? How did you heal?
The way I put it, both in the book and in conversation, I lived for a very long time believing that God hated me. And I thought he was very justified in doing so. The Almighty God, he's very fair. He lives in a very black and white world. And from my perspective, not knowing that I should not feel the shame and responsibility around what was happening, I believed that I deserved all of the blame. And as such, it was completely entitled for the Almighty to hate me in that sense. That's a pretty lonely place to be in. Thinking that God hates you is not very pleasant. And then I went to therapy. And in therapy, I found out that the things that had happened to me were not my fault. They were somebody else's fault. A crime had been done to me. And I discovered at the beginning of the therapeutic experience that I had thought that thinking that God hates me is the loneliest place in the world. Turns out there's a more lonely place. And that is thinking that God just ignored you. At some point, he was supposed to have your back and he was supposed to be watching out for you. And then a bunch of stuff happened that he just let slide. That you'd like to believe that the Almighty God doesn't really allow for children to suffer in this world. And yet on his watch, all of this happened. And then you really kind of run, and then you really run into the dynamic of, it's not just God, but I'm a card carrying Chabad shliach, and I am the one who's responsible to sell God to my community, to encourage people in my community that having a relationship and a connection with God is the most beautiful and valuable and important thing you can do with your life. And God is all seeing and all knowing and all capable and all powerful. And there's this little voice in the back of your head and goes, is that so? So what happened on the days in question? Did he step away from his desk for a moment? Did your file miss the pile? Where'd he go? And it's a tough place to be in. It's a lonelier place to be in. And I think that ultimately that's reality.
a really tough question that so many people have in their own lives, and whatever they're going through.
And
how do you answer that?
And I think that, you mentioned that these are tough questions that people have. At some point, you come to acknowledge that, welcome to the human race.
Mm-hmm.
You have dealt with an inordinate amount of pain and suffering in your life, just like countless others have. And if you want to have a relationship with the Almighty God where he, checks in with you every Monday and Thursday to justify all of his actions, you may have come to the wrong place, because ours is not a faith practice where every time something goes wrong, we send off a letter and the Almighty God sends back 5 pages, perfectly typed, letting us know why he did things. That's not the journey of faith that any of us strive to be on. I think the journey of faith instead is we find ourselves in these sorts of situations and we turn to God and we say to the Almighty, okay, fine, I'm here. What do you want from me now? You've put me here, probably for good reason. What did you have in mind with all this when you gamed all of this out in the all-knowing mind of yours? Where did you see this going? And how can I align my life to be in line with what you had hoped for? The way I put it in the book is that at a certain point, I stopped turning to the Almighty and saying, why me? And I started asking him instead, why me? This happens to a lot of people, but on some level, you wanted it to happen to me. You saw something there that I could somehow contribute to this tapestry. You saw the world being unique with my having gone through these sorts of experiences. Could you just give me a wee bit of perspective into what that is? And I think it helps reconcile a lot of those lonely feelings. And I think that as a Yid, you start to find a place for yourself in the world of the Almighty, and you start to find a role, or the role that he has for you, and you let it all unroll from there. And ultimately, you'll never have all of the answers to all of the questions. And all you can hope to do is live every day in alignment with what exactly it was that he had in mind for you and continues to have in mind for you.
So what do you think he had in mind for you?
I can't say for certain, but at this point, I have decent reason to have come to the conclusion that he feels that there is a difference that I can make in this world in a very unique way, given my circumstances. Mm-hmm. And there's part of me that still wonders on dark days, on lonely days, was it only possible to bring about that difference through all of this pain? This couldn't have happened in an easier fashion. And again, chalk that up to a question that you'll never really have answers to. But at some point, you really begin to hope to find the path that the Almighty has for you in life. He wanted things to break down exactly the way they did so that you'd find yourself in that moment, at that place, to be able to make a unique difference. To put it in the words that were really working for me at the time, specifically as a shliach, if I went about my life having dedicated myself to living a life that the Almighty God wants from me, at some point I should probably be open to the possibility that living the life that he wants from me would be done on his terms and not on mine. Really allow me. I had everything worked out, how this was all going to go. From a very, very young age, I knew exactly how life would look like in the sense of how I would make a difference. And at some point, life comes to you, God comes to you and says, surprise, it's not going to look like that at all. It's going to be very different, in fact. And we spend so much time pushing back on that. And we as human beings, we spend so much time wanting to commit ourselves to a godly life, but on our terms,
Right.
but in our specifics, from our paradigm. And in a certain sense, I think all you've got left to do is to turn to the Almighty God and be like, okay, you know what? You win. You want this done a certain way, but we'll do it your way. We'll do it your way. And I think that's a choice. It's a choice you make every day. It's a mindset you have to plug yourself into every single day. And you hope to find some meaning in your life through that.
Is that why you called your book Not What I Expected?
It's very much why I called my book Not What I Expect. So actually, we didn't end up including the story in the book, but I'll give you a little a brownie point. When I was starting, I talked before about the wall coming down brick by brick. When I started telling people, there was a particular teacher of mine from my yeshiva days that I really wanted to tell. This was the person that I almost told while it was all going on. We had developed that level of closeness and authenticity, and yet I couldn't tell him. I was that shut off. And when I was telling people, I wanted him to be one of the first. And so I got his home number, and one night I called him up. I said, look, I feel like in all of the years that you've known me, I haven't been honest with you, and so I want to be honest with you, and just kind of said everything. And it was quiet for a long minute. And after that minute, first thing he says is, wow, that was not what I expected to hear from you. So it was that moment that kind of was the genesis of that title. But in all honesty, I think that plugging into that mindset and living in that headspace was born from that moment, which kind of became an entire mantra, an entire path in life and a way to live one's life. And it really was the motivation for the title. Yeah.
Interesting. I mean, you also write about how the Rebbe always told you to fill a void, and this was your way of filling a void. You want to expand on that a little bit? So
I live in a very religious town, not my religion per se, but people here are knowledgeable. They enjoy sharing ideas, biblical ideas. And so one of the things that when I moved here, I was new rabbi was in town. People came to meet. Rabbi, tell us about your favorite
just
biblical.
Let everyone know that you live in Utah.
I live in Salt Lake City. Yeah, that's an important caveat.
Right.
I live in Salt Lake City, and I had to quickly identify with what was my favorite biblical passage. And I remember I had a conversation with someone. It was right around Purim. It was the first year I moved here. It was 2015, and that year I learned a farbrengen of the Rebbe from Purim. And the Rebbe talks about the fact that there's this fascinating dialogue that takes place in the Megillah, in the book of Esther. This conversation, a lot of the Megillah kind of is told in generalities. We skip through episodes somewhat generally, and then there are certain moments that are zeroed in on, and there's really powerful back and forth dialogue. And in the 5th chapter of the Megillah, there's this powerful conversation that is literally told to us verbatim between Mordechai and Esther. And Esther finds out that Mordechai is sitting in the center of town wearing sackcloth and ashes, and she panics, and she asks Mordechai what's up, and Mordechai comes back and says, look, there's this decree against the Jewish people, and we're frightened by it, but good news. The good news is we have someone on the inside of the palace that is going to save us all. And that is you. So, get to work. Right, exactly. And Esther's like, hey, hang on. That doesn't work like that. I don't have carte blanche access to the king, and life just doesn't work like that. The same threat of annihilation that you would go through if you walked in unannounced, I would go through the same. And so this is not so simple. And Mordechai responds to Esther in that moment. And the Rebbe points out that what Mordechai says to Esther in that moment doesn't really fit the dialogue. It's not a conversation between two people that's kind of a volley back and forth. They're parrying point for point. Mordechai makes an argument that doesn't really respond to what Esther is saying. And Mordechai says, look, maybe you're right. But have you ever considered that this is the moment that you were made for? And well, Mordechai doesn't say to Esther, he doesn't say, look, come on, Esther, let's talk about this. Let's really get down to the logistics of it. You could do this and you could do that, and you could maneuver the situation this way and that way. Mordechai turns to Esther and says, look, I don't disagree with you. You are in a pickle. You're in a tough spot. But maybe that's exactly the tough spot that you were created to be in. You're this nice, modest Jewish girl who's being raised by her cousin, and you're whisked off to the palace. You ever stop to think why? You ever think for a moment what the grand master plan of the universe had in mind for you, this nice girl, who then out of all the women in the kingdom wins this beauty pageant and is now installed as queen? What does everyone want from you? Maybe this is what is wanted from you. Maybe this is the void that you were meant to step into. And if you don't step into this void, says Mordechai, no worries. Somebody else will. The Jewish people are not going to perish on your watch. Somebody else will. And maybe you'll have missed your moment. And so for me, learning the way the Rebbe approached that conversation, which I think is really a microcosm of the Rebbe's view of the universe, of Judaism's view of the universe. If you see a space, a situation, a dynamic that is not being addressed in that moment, there's two things you can do about that. You can fold your arms and lean back in your chair and be like, it's interesting. It's very unfortunate. Very, very unfortunate that that situation is not being addressed. Or you can ask yourself, why did I find out about this? Why did this come to my attention? There's so many people who could have found out about this, and likely there's so many people that know about it, and yet the situation hasn't changed. The status quo remains the same. Why me? Why do I know about it? Maybe this is my moment. And
interesting. You write in the book how you Googled, male sexual abuse, male Orthodox Jewish sexual abuse survivor, and you didn't find anyone who
Google literally. It was the only time that I can ever remember in my life. Usually you Google one thing and Google will be like, well, we didn't find this, but can we suggest? Can we advertise this to you? And Google literally came back to me and was like, nope, sorry, try it again, nothing. And in that moment, you think to yourself, like, oh wow, this is an unrepresented space. Maybe there's a reason why I know
the real void.
Yeah.
The real void that you decided to fill, and you fill it by becoming an advocate, telling your story, helping people.
You fill it by, I think more than anything, I think you fill it by being a dugma chaya. You fill it by being a role model. And you fill it by, I think, modeling the sort of life that one can have as a survivor. I think it's the greatest way to go about any sort of dynamic in life. It's interesting. I was involved in a conversation just this morning. There was a news clipping from about 2 decades ago. In a more observant community, some of the rabbis in the community decided to put down communal standards around simchas that were happening in their community. People were going into debt to make bar mitzvahs and weddings and engagement parties. And so the rabbis came along and said, these are the standards you must abide by when making a happy occasion in our community. And, things make sense. And then there's 2 lines at the bottom of the paragraph. And at the bottom of the paragraph, it says, if these standards are not met, we will not participate in the happy occasions, with a long list of the communal rabbis. And there's a small asterisk. And it says, barring unusual or extremely necessary situations. And we were having this conversation, a number of us, within the rabbinate, within Jewish leadership, of a sentence like that destroys all the good work you're doing. The idea of, we expect certain things from people, and we'll abide by those things sometimes, most of the times, barring situations that are on our own terms. How can you expect anybody to live by those standards? And so, it was a conversation that I was literally having this morning. But I think that, for me, when thinking about being a public survivor within the community, there are a lot of things that I'd like to see as to how survivors are treated in this community. And I think for me, the most important thing that I could do was to model those behaviors, was to do the things and live the life the way I feel like a survivor should go about their life, and the way I think a survivor can go about their life. And I think in any sort of dynamic you're going to find yourself, the most important thing that you can do in any environment is always lead by example. Lead from the front, provide the display of the behaviors that you want to see others take. And I think it's a good rule for life.
It's really interesting. In the book you wrote about how there was this billboard of you and the mayor,
a senator and a musician.
Right, and a musician, and they were all very, people who have great achievements and great accomplishments. And this is what people can see that a survivor can become. It doesn't have to be somebody who's broken, but this is what a survivor can be.
And to me, I think that that's the most powerful message that we can send to young people who are struggling in a similar situation. We can talk about abstract information. We can publish billboards that have statistics that, as the famous saying goes, 98% of people don't care about statistics. But we can put up a billboard that says, 64% of survivors go on to do X, Y, and Z, or we could put up 3 faces of people in town. And, look, here's a random tidbit of information. Here are 3 people that live here in town. You may have seen them, you may have interacted with them, you may have met them, and they're survivors, and they're okay with that, and they're going about their life, and they're trying to lead productive lives. So can you. It's not about a number anymore, and it's not about abstract outside information. It's about people, and it creates something that you hope other people can relate to and can live up to.
And I guess it's a broader message, not only for survivors as well, but survivors of any kind of abuse or any kind of difficulty or hardship or challenge. I mean, particularly survivors of sexual abuse, but of anyone. There's a morning after that, which really brings me to this beautiful quote that you wrote. You were driving in your car to decide whether or not to take your story public, and a song quoting Psalm 92 came on. And it said, "To proclaim your kindness in the morning and our faith in you at night." Those words spoke to me. There are mornings, times of light, clarity, and certainty. In the mornings, we proclaim God's kindness. But then there are also nights, times of darkness, confusion, and uncertainty. In the night, we may not feel the kindness. We may not have so much left to give, but we can have faith. Faith that if we just keep going through the night, the morning will come again. So I thought that was so beautiful. How can a survivor of abuse hold on to their faith after experiencing their horrors?
So that car ride in question was the afternoon before it was all supposed to go down. And I would say that when thinking about the totality of the anxiety and the paranoia around the topic, that afternoon was probably at the all-time high. This was, your feet are at the edge of the diving board. It's either right now, jump or don't jump. There's not a lot of plank left to walk. And it was on my Spotify playlist, and it came on, and it came to me in that moment that it is easy in times of affluence and prosperity and happiness to get up and proclaim the Almighty's involvement in your life, and to thank the Almighty for His presence and His blessings in your life. That's easy, and we do that, with great regularity. And at times, it is more difficult to do that when the rubber hits the road. I had a conversation a couple of weeks ago with a good friend of mine, also a Chabad rabbi, and he was sharing with me a profoundly personal struggle that he was going through. And I said to him, I tried to validate the pain that he was in. And I said to him, "Let me ask you a question. What would you say right now if Bob, you're the biggest donor in your community, a guy you're really close with, called you up and shared this news with you? Mm-hmm. What would you say to him?"
Share the news that he was...
Whatever he was going through, Bob was going through. You were on the other side of the phone call.
Got it, right.
And this guy, and he says to me, I'd be sad for him, and I'd be sad with him. I said, yeah, okay, I tried to do that. And he said, and I don't know, I'd tell him that the Almighty has a plan for him. Mm-hmm. And I said, great. Well, Bob wants you to know the Almighty has a plan for you too. And again, it's easy for us to tell the other person, in their moments of darkness, have faith, man. But at that point, on a certain sense, I think that the real test of emunah for Yid, the real test of having faith, is when it's all you have. It's very easy to tap into that when faith is there amongst a number of other blessings that you have in your life. But when you're in a situation where your choices are rock and hard place, and the only tool you feel like you have at hand is your faith, that too is an accomplishment. That too is a gift from the Almighty, and it should be recognized by us with the same vigor and the same excitement as we would out of a place of affluence and generosity and prosperity. And so that was something which I felt in the moment, and I'm grateful that it carried me through. It really kind of carried the day and allowed. It was something which I was able to tap into throughout this process. But again, I think it goes back to the idea that faith in this instance looks like turning to the Almighty God and saying, I don't know what you want from me, but I really am holding on to the fact that you want something from me. I don't know what that is, but I am sure that if I keep on doing my part, you'll show me what that is. So let's do this.
I guess that shows God's confidence in you.
Right. There's, we talked about billboards. I actually don't know the denomination, but there's a group here in town that put up billboards a long time ago. I'm not sure if you believe in God. He sure believes in you, which was something which I really relate to. I think it's a very Jewish idea. I don't know if it was a Jewish organization, but right. It comes from somewhere. But that idea of, again, I don't know what you want from me, but I trust that you're going to show me. So here we go. Show me what you want. And that gave me strength in those moments.
You spoke about pressing charges against this nanny, this caregiver who abused you. And you say that the reason why was not even so much to give her jail time. It wasn't about that. It wasn't about punishing her. It was about being heard. What does that mean? Why did you decide to press charges?
So I think at the most basic level, I decided to report because there was a sense of injustice in the world. Yeah, at a certain level, when you go for so long thinking that you have done something wrong and you're finally given to correctly and properly understand that you haven't done something wrong. Mm-hmm. Something very wrong has been done to you. You feel like there's injustice in your life, and injustice is something which warrants correction. It warrants justice. So I reported. If I'm being totally frank, when I reported, the odds, if I would have asked someone that morning, I'm going to go cold call the Salt Lake City Police Department and tell them about something which happened roughly 2 decades ago. What are the odds of this story continuing past today? Just given what we know about how the criminal justice system works, odds were maybe 1 in 10,000. It's a delayed report. It's from a long time ago. There's no evidence. And so I reported, and I write about this in the book, I talk about this publicly. I reported to check the box. I reported more than anything to go back to my mental health professional and say, see, I did it. Mm-hmm. I did it. Let's close that chapter and move on to the next phase of healing. I did what you asked of me. And then at some point, an investigation did ensue and it developed. And as I write about, when my abuser was arrested, it was Erev Pesach. I was not in town when it happened. We had already gone to my wife's family for Pesach. And the first moment where I really realized what this journey was going to entail, I'm standing on the porch of my in-laws' house, and the world is crumbling around me. And I'm kind of taking some space, and my father-in-law comes outside. Now, bear in mind, my father-in-law at this point had known about this for 2 days. It's a lot. It's a reality check for everybody. And he comes outside and he puts his arm around my shoulders and he says, I just heard about the arrest. How do you feel? Do you feel all better? And I turned around to him and I said, no, no, I don't. I'm not sure if this was supposed to trigger some sort of happy release for me, but it didn't. And anybody who thinks that it did or that it should or that it would, I want a refund, because that's not what happened. Mm-hmm. And that moment, everything kind of crystallized all at once. Healing does not necessarily come from harsh sentences. The healing doesn't come from people being in handcuffs. Healing is something which is a road that you go down personally. And people don't have to suffer, and lengthy sentences don't have to be handed out for you to heal, for you to move past that. And it was really in that moment that I came to understand how profoundly personal that journey is. And the system was going to go ahead and do whatever it was going to do. And it was going to go off, be the criminal justice system. But healing was going to be a personal journey from that point forward. And I'm grateful to have worked with professionals, the prosecution team, and others who were very clear about that with me. We want this system to bring you a sense of closure. And so we're going to determine our path and the actions that we take based on that guiding principle, based on that North Star. If this feels just to you, then we'll pursue it. If it doesn't, then why are we doing this? We want this to bring about closure for you. And it was important.
So it's interesting, because at the end, you actually forgave your abuser. And you said you don't want that anymore in your head. You want to continue. She's had enough power over you in your thoughts. And now you just want to go about leaving her behind and going about living your life and helping others. How did you find it within you to actually find this forgiveness?
I think I think in society, we understand forgiveness as something which is almost accrued, it's deserved. We will forgive someone if we feel like they have merited forgiveness. Forgiveness is something which we award to others given their performance, given their behavior. If they have met the criteria that we put in place, then they are worthy of this tremendous gift that we provide to them called forgiveness. I think there was a moment where I came to realize that for me personally, that couldn't have been further from the truth. And for me personally, forgiveness is something which I give myself. Forgiveness is something which benefits the person giving it far more than the person receiving it. And I could forgive because it would make me feel better and it would allow me to live my life from that moment.
So what does forgiveness mean to you?
Forgiveness for me means release. Forgiveness for me means the decision to not hold on to resentment. I firmly believe that given what's happened to me in life, I'm entitled to just a bucket load of resentment. If I wanted to utilize it, if I wanted to tap into it, I would have it there at my disposal that I could just dig from every single day. And every single morning I could wake up and go to the corner to just this chest of resentment and scoop some into my cup and carry it with me the entire day. And I don't think anybody would have any claims to me that I'm not entitled to that resentment.
Absolutely.
And if I were to do that, all the power to me. The only person that I would be hurting would be myself. The subject of my resentment could be hundreds of miles away, would have no idea that I was feeling resentful towards them in that moment. And they certainly would not be suffering the aftershocks of my resentment. I carry it around and I have to deal with it. And for me, forgiveness meant deciding to step away from that. I'm not going to be upset about it anymore. And if I am, that's my problem that I have to deal with. For me, being resentful is just not worth it for me. And I want to forgive on my terms and on nobody else's terms.
Wow. That's very powerful because we all have people that we do not forgive or we have resentments or anger against who have hurt us. And that's a very powerful way of looking at forgiveness.
I appreciate that. It was a difficult thing to do for sure. And the most powerful part of the story is that my abuser beforehand had not asked for said forgiveness, and in fact, at the actual hearing where I read that statement, she didn't know what to do with herself in that moment.
Right.
But again, I think for me it reinforces that I will forgive because I choose to forgive, and nobody else needs to do anything in line with that.
And it means she no longer has power over you, over your bond.
Right. I'm not going to.
You wrote a lot that the abuse is much more than a sexual attraction. It's more this abuse of power, and I found that interesting. That it has more to do with power than anything else. Can you explain that a little bit?
So I wrote about that somewhat extensively in my impact statement. That when this case began and it became evident that this case was going to trial, the prosecutor understood, a remarkable woman. She understood that she had an uphill battle to fight over here. On one hand, you have my abuser was 70 when she went to trial. As we talked about it back then, my abuser could have walked out of the courtroom and walked across the hall to a Grandmother of the Year pageant and would have fit in seamlessly in either room. And you've got to convince 9 perfect strangers that this woman did unspeakable things for a very long time. How and why? For starters, when all this was going on, my abuser was happily married, had 3 kids of her own. If we think about sexual violence as something which stems from romance or sexual attraction or connection in any of those terms, you're going to convince nobody of this. This is just bad news. And I think what the prosecutor did so masterfully was her ability to communicate to the jury that this has got very little to do with romance, love, attraction. This is the sort of environment where an adult wields a certain power over a child. And the reason why an adult will do that in most instances is because they had a power deficiency in their own life at some point. And the only place they can try and take that back and try to settle the score and balance the scales is to take it back from someone who it's easy to take their power. It is far easier to take a child's power than an adult's power. And that is why that sort of person does this sort of thing. It's not about romance or attraction or love. It is about who is someone that I can wield that power over and feel the power that was taken from me at such a young age. And sadly, that is why very often a lot these situations are cyclical, and people who were once hurt as children, sadly,
the same.
Will go on to continue because the power was taken from them, so they go and take it from somebody else, who goes on to take it from somebody else, and on it goes. And at some point, someone decides to pursue healing and says, "Okay, enough. Power was taken from me, and I can reclaim that, and I don't need to hurt any children in the process."
Wow.
And that's really
how we break the cycle.
Yeah.
I found also very interesting when you wrote about Elizabeth Smart, how she was a survivor who came to see you. She came to see you in a coffee shop, and you wrote, "I'll never forget the moment she walked into the coffee shop on a cold January morning, carrying her baby in a car seat. If you want to make an impact on someone's life, show up to coffee in the middle of a snowstorm, baby in hand. That's advocacy. Sit down with someone who needs a friend." How can people help someone going through abuse or through any difficult situation?
I mean, imagine what you would want if you were in that sort of situation. We live in an age where more and more we place more of an emphasis on opinion over experience. We give a lot of credence to people who have certain beliefs around certain topics, as opposed to elevating the voices of those who have been through those sorts of topics and want to inform policy or practice around those areas that they have been through themselves. On the day in question, when Elizabeth Smart came to meet me at a coffee shop in Park City, which is after she had taken out of her time to just call me out of the blue, Elizabeth Smart was an accomplished multiple-time New York Times bestselling author. She has a remarkable foundation here in town. She's got a full calendar, beyond the fact that she had a newborn back when the story happened. And she knew of someone in need, and she got in the car and she went to Starbucks.
And the stranger who she just happened to have heard about, right?
And right, a mutual friend put us in touch, and she went to Starbucks and she met a total stranger. That's healing. That's how we rectify pain and suffering in this world, and that coffee changed my life forever. It really influenced how I see advocacy, how I see taking time and resources and energy to deal with survivors. And I'm fortunate to be able to do a lot of work in the advocacy space, and people who know me well, and my wife and others who know my time and my schedule know that there will be all sorts of important things to do. My cell phone number is readily available in a dozen places, and if a call or a text or a DM on Instagram comes in from a total stranger, all of that fades away in the space of that. Wow. Because all these lofty ideals of advocacy and we're going to make the world better for children should pale in comparison to the opportunity to actually make the world better for a child or someone who was once a child. And so that was a coffee that gave me perspective that I can never move away from. I guess
it just expands your definition of a shliach. Just show up and be there for whoever's in need.
And just to kind of expound on that point, I think a lot of parents I speak to say, my kid disclosed to me and I didn't know what to say, or what do I say if my child discloses to me? And most often the answer I provide is don't say anything. Mm-hmm. No one wants to hear what you have to say at that moment. What the child in your life wants to ascertain in that moment is, can you listen? Mm-hmm. So often we'll be in conversations, we'll share something with somebody and we'll still be mid-sentence and we already see the wheels in their head turning. Mm-hmm. They're formulating a response before we've even finished saying what it is that we need to say. My wife laughs. I have this annoying habit on WhatsApp. If I listen to a voice note, start typing out a response to the voice note mid listening to the voice note. But very, very often someone will send me a minute-long voice note, and I'll write it. I'll text them a response to the first 30 seconds, and then what they said in the second 30 seconds will deem that whole response completely, useless. We do that as human beings. Someone's in the middle of sharing something very profound, and we're already piecing together just this award-winning response, and all they want is to just listen.
Just listen.
Just hear them out. Just hear them out. Mm-hmm. And that was a coffee that changed my life.
Just listen and just be there. Just show up.
Car seat in hand.
Okay, Remy, can you share with us? Do you have the book there again?
I sure do.
Okay, Not What I Expected.
It is available on Amazon. Oh my goodness, I'm going to get this in the frame. There we go. It's available on Amazon. We can include a link in the show notes. Not What I Expected of Remy Zippel. It'll be widely released in just over a month, May 23rd. And I'm excited. I'm part's terrified, part's excited, but I'm excited for the world to see it.
Wow. What would you like people to hear from your story in a nutshell? I mean, there's so many different components, but what's the one thing that you really want people to take away?
What I'd like them to take away, I think, is kind of is in line with what we were talking about so much of this conversation is, I came into my adult life with a very clear definition of what it would look like. And it turns out that truly living a life of making an impact and making a difference is not at all what I expected. And I think what I would encourage people to take away from the book is there's a good chance the same is likely true in your life. That specifically the lane that you had in mind for yourself might not be the best place for you to make a very unique difference in this world. And I think that the world becomes a better place when each of us shuts up and listens to a certain extent and is open and willing to finding where that lane for us is. And it might be very different than what we once expected, but is ready to step into that void and make that difference in the world.
Wow. I think all of us feel at some point in time, hey, that was not what I expected. But what you're doing is taking the not what I expected and making it very much the path that you're meant to be running.
I think that's life on some level.
Thank you so much for joining us, Rabbi
Remy
Zippel from Salt Lake City, Utah, with his book, Not What I Expected. I thought the book was amazing. I read it and I couldn't put it down. So not only was it teaching such important, valid points, it also it's also a thrill reader. You just can't put it down. You just keep turning the pages. So you did a fantastic job.
And
I wish you continued success in all that you do in your many, many roles as a shliach, advocate, memoirist, speaker, and many more.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for joining us.